Pleasure to be with you. St. John the 23rd, where I teach, is in Katy, Texas. So we're just outside of Houston, and it's an independent Catholic school and relatively young. We opened our doors in 2004. And we have about 400 students at this point. Now we've been around for, I guess, what is that, 16 years. Everything is still like, the paint is still drying in some ways as we're charting our course forward. And so the international student program, therefore, is relatively young. And I'm, relatively new to it as well. I would say, so, we started to really kind of ramp up having international students somewhere around 2016, 2017. And it grew very quickly. We have a wonderful international student director here who I know has been on conferences with you all before, Susie Kramer. And the program just kind of, came alive under her. And actually, I think certainly became one of the largest in the Catholic schools in this area, and if not in the rest of Texas. Our culture as a school is that Catholic identity is very central here. We're really heavily committed to it. So my job as chaplain, I teach theology, but I'm also the chaplain for the school. We have daily mass available. Confession is available every day. We actually have a confessional right off of where the kids eat lunch. We have weekly all student mass. We have, when there's not COVID, we have weekly adoration in our chapel. It's a lot. If you're not familiar with Catholic religion or Catholic culture, it's a lot of stuff that's going to hit you very quickly as you come into it. And my first year that I was here, the decision had already been made to try to move the international students into a particular theology class for them. So we have theology, just like what Dr. Megan was saying about his school. We have theology all 4 years. The pieces are in slightly different places than they are for you guys, but it's a required course for all 4 years for all of our students. Students were coming into our program, and they're getting, in the first year that they're here as freshmen, they're getting Doctrine of God, they're getting Thomas Aquinas and the 5 ways, right? Like they're getting like heavy abstract stuff. And our international students, and particularly, because the largest population that we had in that group was Chinese students and still is Chinese students, were getting kind of lost in it. It was like too much all at once. And so the thought was, okay, well, why don't we have a separate class where we can speak to their needs? Something that we've actually done before, when we have students who come in from public school sometimes, or from a Protestant background or something like that, we'll have an Intro to Catholicism class. But that's not what this was. This was, we'll do the regular theology class. It's just that this class will be all international kids. What we found was that wasn't enough. So that year, we have a non-credit class that all the international students take that is basically like, I forget what our official title is for it, but it's essentially like a cultural help class, where they're being where they have an opportunity to ask questions and kind of get assimilated to certain things and figure stuff out that they wouldn't have the chance to do just dropped into some of their other classes. And so Susie Kramer and I did that together. I was helping these kids a lot with their theology because it was hitting them, but it wasn't making sense to them. And so we figured out that, okay, a dedicated class for international students is not a bad idea, but it's really got to look different if it's going to actually be worthwhile. And especially because we love the fact that we have international students here and that we're getting to meet with them, but we're not experts. I don't speak Chinese. I've never been to China. So we're learning as much culturally as they are, which is good, which is actually part of the point. Like, part of the reason why we want these students here is not just so that they can learn from us, but so that we can also learn from them, and so that our students can have that experience. But it's just overwhelming for them, because here they are, and they've come halfway around the world. They don't necessarily speak the language very well. They're trying to get used to America. They're trying to get used to Texas, which is its own special universe. And by the way, they're teenagers, so they're already trying to get used to like a whole different life than they've ever had before. So, okay, so let's retool the class. And so we decided to do that, and they made me the teacher for it. And all right, let's do it, when we're going to do it differently this time. But here's the challenge that I had going into this. So that year that I developed this, we had most of our international students were in that class. So I had 19 kids in this class. I think there were 3 or 4 other international students here who opted to stick with the regular stuff. But so I've got 19 kids in the class from 3 different countries: China, Vietnam, and Korea, South Korea, in all 4 grade levels. So I've got freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors at all different levels of English proficiency, right? Some of these kids could sit down and read Tolstoy, and some of them are having trouble just like following really simple directions. And with completely different religious backgrounds. I had like 2 of my Vietnamese kids were Catholic. I had Buddhists, I had animists, I had a lot of atheist kids, and a lot of the kids from China who didn't have any background at all with any kind of religion. As Dr. Megan was mentioning, largely Han students, but we also had 3 Uyghur students at the time, 2 of whom were in my class. So I had 2 Muslims in the class. So, this was a lot to balance as a teacher. What I did, for a long time, I tried to find something that would work for all of this. As I was trying to develop it the summer before. And basically, I eventually came to realize there's just like no way to do that. And so, okay, we're going to have to just start from scratch. So I decided to use what was basic, as a sort of basic outline, our sophomore curriculum. Because while I had all 4 grade levels, the largest group amongst them at that point was sophomores. But I also did that for a reason, because our sophomore year is Christology and salvation, and then there's a little bit about the church at the end of it. And I thought, okay, perfect. Because the thing that I really wanted for these kids, that I realized from having talked to them and gotten to know them, that they needed, was the story itself, right? Just like Dr. Megan says his students were saying to him, they had no idea. They had no idea, and so this made it very different from the intro class from kids from public school or Protestant, or even kids who had no religious background who come in here but who are American. They get things that these students wouldn't get. You can make a reference. I remember a couple of years ago, of course, LeBron James has been in and out and back and forth, but I remember like that first time, he's coming back to Cleveland, and the headline in the paper was like, "Prodigal son returns," which of course is not what prodigal means. But but nevertheless, right? Like, what is that headline playing off of? It's playing off of everybody in our culture has some knowledge of the story of the prodigal son. That headline means nothing to these kids, right? The stuff about Christmas and Easter and so forth, very, very little. For a lot of them, even just the concept of God is huge and hard for them to begin to wrap their heads around. So I wanted them to really just get the story, and I wanted it to be focused on Jesus. They needed something concrete. And so, I didn't want to spend the whole year talking about God in a way that made him seem like he's out on a cloud somewhere in the ether. I wanted to talk about Jesus, who I can say, okay, here's who Jesus is, here's what he did, here's where he went, here's what he said, here's how we have responded to that for the last 2,000 years. So I threw out the textbook and I made their only textbook the Bible. I let them have a catechism as well, and we used that a little bit, but that's really, you know, like we would use that very sparingly and I would have to explain it a lot when I did. But mostly it was just, you know, the Bible, making them read the English translation that we were using. So they could read the Bible in their own language, but they also needed to read it in the English translation. Then in terms of approach, you know, we just kind of moved through the year, through the story, right? So we started at the beginning, framed it largely on, I think it was framed largely on Matthew's gospel, but bringing in stuff from the other gospels as we went. And I would have them read something between each class, and then they would come in, and basically almost every class period would begin with a daily short comprehension quiz. So I would give them a 2-question quiz that usually had a 1-word or 2-word answer for each of these questions. And it would be on whatever they read for that day, and whatever we'd been talking about in the previous class. So this was really just like, this is how I'm going to know whether or not you guys are getting any of what I'm saying to you. We would do that, and then I would highlight individual words and phrases. I did a lot of repetition of terms, making sure that students could follow the story. I would use short videos, stuff that I could find, especially like stuff on YouTube is great because now a lot of the YouTube videos, even if they don't have subtitles, you can set it up to subtitle it. And so that was helpful for them too, because then they could watch that in class, we could talk about it, but then they could go home and watch it again and catch whatever the pieces were that they hadn't got the first time around. I would, and I just kind of got used to where they were at too. I think the more familiar you are with your students, because a lot of these kids, this was the second year I was teaching them, the more familiar you are with them, the more you get what they're doing. And so I got used to figuring out what the tell was for when this kid is not understanding what I'm saying, but is pretending like they understand what I'm saying because they think that they have to understand what I'm saying. And just kind of making sure that everybody is getting it at the level that they can get it at. I'd also used a lot of examples from home countries whenever I could. So for instance, when we talked about the Blessed Virgin Mary, I used Marian figures from their country. So I would use like Our Lady of China, Our Lady of Lavang for the Vietnamese students, like finding ways to kind of connect them in with that stuff. I'd show them things like, I noticed on the website that you guys have up that video that America magazine did, whenever that was, several years ago, about Catholicism in China. So I showed that one day in class, right? And we talked about that. So anything that I could do that could kind of ground them back in it. Trial and error. And so, some of this stuff worked really well and some of it didn't work very well. I'll give you an example of each. So something that did not work very well was they had to do a research paper. That was kind of a decision outside of my hands, because usually we have a research paper in the junior year in theology. Because I had a couple of junior students, they said, well, you need to do a research paper. Well, but I've got 4 grade levels. We'll figure it out. So I made the requirements slightly different depending on what grade the students were in. But that was just really difficult all the way through, because not just because of language barriers and all that kind of stuff, but because even the concept of what it was I was asking them for in a research paper was very hard for them to get. It's hard for current American teenagers to understand the difference between, Wikipedia and a research paper. And so it was like doubly hard for Chinese students. In some cases, we had issues with, I want to be careful how I say this, we had issues with plagiarism, but it wasn't exactly plagiarism. Like, it was them not understanding that what we were calling plagiarism was not acceptable. So it was not them trying to do something nefarious. It was them not getting the distinction, basically. I would say that was something that I went, okay, well, we're not going to do the paper anymore with the international class. One thing we did that worked very well in the second semester, I talked the first half of the semester, we talked a lot about Jesus and the resurrection, right? And by then they'd had the story of Jesus all the way up until that point, and they'd had the crucifixion and all this stuff. So we talked about the resurrection. But one of the things I wanted to give to them, because my goal in all of this, be awesome if they all came to the end of the class and they're like, we all want to be Catholic, yes. But realistically, my goal was really like, okay, whatever you believe when you walk away from this, I want you to understand what Catholicism is. And I want you to understand it in a way that you can see that it's reasonable, even if you don't buy it, right? For a variety of reasons, I want them to understand that. Not least being that, in their lives, they will have opportunities to interact with Christians and Catholics, and even if they're just doing a business deal or something with somebody, it's helpful to have an insight into their worldview. So when I taught the resurrection, I taught the biblical material, I taught what the church teaches, but then I said, all right, let's talk about philosophical arguments for and against. And so I gave them a number of what I thought were the best philosophical arguments for the historic reality of the resurrection. I gave them some of what I thought were the best arguments against the historic reality of the resurrection. And then what I did was separated them into two teams and had them prepare, and we had a trial. And I brought in some panelists from the outside to judge, not who actually proved or disproved it, but like who was the most prepared, who made the best argument. And I put them on teams irregardless of what their actual views were. So some of the students, because like my Korean girls were all Presbyterian, so but some of them ended up on the arguing against the resurrection, and some of the atheist kids ended up having to argue for the resurrection. They loved that. They found that to be just fascinating, that was something that we would even tolerate doing, and really kind of expanding to the point that, one of our kids wrote it was like in her senior memories in the yearbook that year. I opened it up and it's, oh, the time we had the trial in theology class. As far as like all of the little details of curriculum stuff, anybody who's interested, I'm happy to share my notes with. I don't think that I have like created the be all and end all of how to do this by any stretch of the imagination. I think there's a lot of room here to develop something more and to develop it more intentionally so that it could be shared in various settings around the country. But I do think that having an approach that is thinking about where these students are coming from, that is Christ-centered as opposed to something more abstract, and that is Bible-centered, is probably the way to go.
Well, Father Jonathan, I was busy taking notes. That's brilliant. I mean, you took almost an impossible situation and you got in there with your students. I mean, you did what a teacher has to do. And I often, as a teacher, I think I mentioned that I taught theology. I was always preoccupied by getting across certain ideas and concepts. But what you did was you met the students where they're at and you engaged them there. And I think especially if you're dealing with an international population, with people with such diverse backgrounds, finding that meeting point is probably the most important first step. So I'm sure that wasn't easy, but I appreciate you're taking the time to share both the process of exploration, some of the successes and failures, but especially what you're able to achieve with these students and your approach. So again, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to share that experience with us. And I'd like to open this up to questions and comments from our audience here.
Father Jonathan, of course, teacher to teacher. This is great. I'm learning so much. Father Jonathan, just real quickly, so each year, is it the same kids all 4 years? Is that how that works?
So the thought was that we would kind of move them in groupings. The program has kind of hit a little bit of a wall because of COVID. So when everything sort of got pulled apart, we lost a number of students that way. It's proven to be impossible to do it online that way. Our hope is that we can do this again once we can kind of settle it. This is why I was asking you about, because I really don't know, and I struggle with this even just teaching American students. I don't know how to do this kind of thing with international students online, because so much of what they need is the fact that they're in the room with you.
Yes. Yeah. That's especially like it's almost like sometimes I'm sure you run it almost like a yeshiva when you're reading it, because here's my Chinese English, right? And you're reading it and you're stopping and what does that mean? Because one thing we do is we have our freshmen, the lights, is buy the Bible, and then we make them highlight and write in, and they can use that for quizzes and tests. And then watch. And I like that you use. You're using Matthew's. Yeah. Our junior year does that. And I think that's very wonderful, great idea that you do that. Do you kind of march through it, or you pick and choose? What do you do when you do that? What's best?
I am picking and choosing, but I'm roughly going in the order that it's there in. I'm trying to put myself back in the framework of when I was initially thinking through it. I was trying to figure out chunks that you could work with. And Matthew, I think seemed like the best choice because while Mark probably would have been easier for them to read, and I did give them some stuff from Mark sometimes, so I'd switch it out occasionally if it seemed to make sense. But I wanted to give them one of the Gospels that had the infancy stuff. Right. Matthew seemed like the best choice out of those, between Matthew and Luke, and to just get a little more expansive in terms of things that I could then relate back to Old Testament passages. Very good. So I'd give them a story from the Gospel, and then when we would walk through it and talk about it, that would give me an opportunity to have them look at a verse or a couple of verses from somewhere in the Old Testament. So actually a big part of the first, I think even before we started reading any of the Bible, I spent the first week or two of class just teaching them how to read the Bible. Yeah. Literally, okay, this is what the numbers mean. This is the difference between the Old and the New Testament. But I also would tell them, because of course the joke is that, we're Catholics. We wrote the Bible, we just don't read it. And so I would tease the kids a little bit, and I'd say all right, listen, by the end of this year, you are going to know your Bibles better than the Catholic students, the American students in the class next door. And I don't know if I achieved that or not, but I kind of hope I did. So that was the thought about it. But then that also would give me the opportunity to do things like have them read in class. Because I like that. I like having them read out loud. I'd have them act stuff out sometimes, which they grew to like. Some of them hated that at the beginning, but anything that could reinforce the narrative for them.
That's brilliant. When you said reinforce the narrative, right? And then you can use part of the series, the Bible, to watch part of it. Did you do those sort of things? And
yeah, I didn't use that series in particular, but that certainly would work. I would use anything I could find. I did the story of the Good Samaritan with them, and I found a video on YouTube, I think, where somebody had done it with Lego.
Oh,
and
yes.
animated it, and there's no talking at all. And they watched that, and they said they understood the story better after they watched that than they did when they read
Wow.
it.
See, this would be
So
great to kind of go back and forth, because we use the Bible Project videos, which are very
Mhm.
powerful too. But it'd be great to have this sort of treasure chest of, here's what you could use for this, but here's what you could use for that. I would love to pick your brain on that. That would be powerful. Thank you.
yeah, we'll trade notes.
I'd like that.
Well, this is a wonderful exchange, and I think we need to expand the opportunity for such an exchange to bring in other people. So I look forward to doing that, as I mentioned, at our conference this summer. I think that we can all learn from one another. One of the things that we hope to do in the China Association is help to bring people together so that they can share these very valuable experiences. I have one question myself, and I want to throw this out to you. Because I hear this over and over again, that students from China have difficulty making sense of things. Now, sometimes I wonder, is that because they don't understand the concepts, or are they having difficulty making sense of the fact that people really believe this stuff? In other words, when they first come, had they, they knew that there were ideas, religious ideas out there in the universe, but to actually encounter people who really believe this stuff, that there's a whole society where people actually live it, right? Do you think that is an issue at all and that wouldn't be for Muslims, it wouldn't be for Presbyterians from Korea, it wouldn't be for Uyghurs from Xinjiang, but do you think that's an issue for some of the students who just come from a completely secular background?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is probably part of it. But yeah, no, and then there's definitely this sort of this idea of a kind of especially because a lot of these kids, have never met a religious person.
Mm-hmm.
And like the Chinese kids were shocked to discover that just how many Catholics there are in China. Like that was a revelation to them. But I think that they would also say things like, well, we believe in it, and actually in this way, it not terribly different from what you get from American kids sometimes. Well, we believe in science as a juxtaposition, like, oh no, we don't believe in that stuff. We believe in what science tells us about the world. It's a revelation to them that those things can coexist. And that's why I say, like, even regardless of what they believe at the end of the class, I do want them to see the ways in which Catholic belief, Christian belief is reasonable, right? Like we're not all just like blind idiots, following a fairy tale, but like, and I was really struck by what Dr. Meegan was saying about philosophy being taught. Because I find that to be so important. With the international kids, it would have been hard to start there, and we kind of got into that towards the end. But I find that with my American kids, I mean, I'm teaching juniors moral theology, mm-hmm. And asking kids to come into a moral theology class with no philosophy background is like asking kids to take physics who have never had math. It's just giving them some kind of structure to see how things can be built.
Father Jonathan, that's what a great insight into an insight. And so we spend, because we've discussed it as an archdiocese, we have 13 schools, and we discuss the need to understand the difference, because kids will graduate from high school and think that you can't, either it's science or it's God. And so in the freshman year, we do have 3 days where we separate scientific thinking from philosophical thinking from theological thinking. And it's made a big difference doing that just before we do Genesis 1:1. So that's been huge. And so it's they're Google Docs where they watch the videos, they talk about it, we talk about it as a class. And by the end, I can put up, so what is this statement? What type of a question is this? Oh, it's a scientific statement. Oh, it's a philosophical statement. So it has nothing to do with God. Right. So that one statement. So it's been really powerful for us. But again, that's something that we want to work all the way through. And I think that that's a great in for our kids, especially as much, I know the senior year, we do Eastern philosophy also. So we do African philosophy and how it relates to theology and also social justice. You'd be surprised how important this becomes when they look at it from their own point of view. But thank you very much. That was great. Appreciate that input.
Fascinating. I want to throw out one other question. So you had this opportunity to work with Chinese international students. You have to stretch yourself to do that. Do you think that experience has changed how you then work with American students or people who are cradle Catholics?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has, for me, like opened my kind of way of sort of thinking about what that experience must be like. It forces me to see where the presuppositions are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's always a good thing, because the worldview that a lot of our international kids are coming with, well, the worldviews, because they're coming from different places, are often very different from a Catholic worldview or an American worldview. But I think we can also lose track of the fact that the wider culture that we live in has a different worldview. And so, getting used to working with international students and thinking of it in those terms of how am I going to help, how am I going to see their worldview and help them to see the one I'm trying to present to them, is also helpful when I turn around and look at American kids who, even when they're, coming from deeply Catholic families and so on and so forth, are like very shaped by the cultural landscape, pop culture and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't understand that stuff, at least on some level, not only am I not going to get them, I'm not going to get why they can't engage with this material.
I found this very stimulating opportunity to learn from your experience and your dedication. I think that you wouldn't garner these insights if you didn't really put your whole selves into this teaching experience. So we're very privileged to have you share these reflections with us. I thank you very much, and I look forward to keeping in touch and continuing our conversation. Thank you both.